They called it the land of the free, but the freedom that built it was born from chains. In the early 1800s, ships began sailing not from Africa to America, but from America back to Africa. On board were men and women who had once been enslaved, some born in bondage, others the children of those who had survived the Middle Passage. Each carried the same question in their hearts: could a land born from slavery ever truly be free? They were sent by an organization called the American Colonization Society, a strange alliance of abolitionists, politicians, and even slaveholders who agreed on only one thing: that black people had no future in America. Their solution was to send them back to Africa. But back to where? Most of those freed had never seen the continent. Africa was not a homeland they remembered, but a dream they inherited, something distant, sacred, and painful all at once. When the ships reached a coast of red soil and thick mangroves, the freed settlers stepped onto land that local tribes called the Pepper Coast. They built homes from ship timber, planted corn in the rain-soaked earth, and raised the American flag on African ground. They called their new colony Liberia, the land of liberty, and named its capital Monrovia after a U.S. president who would never set foot there. For some, it was a rebirth, a long-delayed homecoming. For others, it was another exile under a different flag. Because the people who came back brought more than memories. They carried the language, the religion, and the hierarchy of the world that had once enslaved them. And over time, the freed would become rulers, while the natives became the ruled. This is the story of Liberia, a nation born from the paradox of freedom, where liberation and loss walked hand in hand, and where a people's return home would forever change the history of two continents. The ocean that once carried millions away from Africa now carried a few hundred back. But the sea did not forget. The same waves that had swallowed the cries of the enslaved now whispered to those who returned. They looked out at the horizon, unsure whether they were going home or beginning again. The year was 1820. The first ship, Elizabeth, left New York Harbor with 88 settlers and 3 white agents from the American Colonization Society. Among the passengers were preachers, carpenters, farmers, and mothers, holding children born free yet branded by history. For weeks, the Atlantic roared around them. Storms tore sails, sickness spread below deck, and prayers filled the air thick with salt and fear. Some did not survive the voyage. The survivors landed on a small island at the mouth of the Mesurado River, feverish, starving, but alive. They called it Providence Island, as if to convince themselves that God had led them here. The land was not empty. It had never been. The Dey, Bassa, and Kru peoples lived along that coast for centuries, their villages built from palm and clay, their trade routes stretching inland. To them, the newcomers were strangers, who spoke a foreign tongue, wore foreign clothes, and built wooden crosses where sacred trees once stood. At first, they traded salt for rice, cloth for palm oil. But misunderstandings came quickly. The settlers believed they had purchased the land. The tribes believed they had agreed to share it. When the settlers began building forts, suspicion turned to conflict. Arrows met gunfire. Smoke rose above the mangroves. The dream of freedom began with blood. More ships arrived over the years. The Nautilus, the Harriet, the Jupiter. Each brought new settlers, and each brought the same illusion, that they were returning home. But Africa had changed, and so had they. They called themselves americoliberians. They dressed in Western coats even under the burning sun. They built houses with porches and white fences that looked like those in Virginia or Maryland. They printed newspapers and elected councils, modeling their tiny colony after the republic they had left behind. They spoke of liberty, yet they built walls, invisible, cultural, and real, between themselves and the people of the land. The americoliberians saw themselves as civilizers. The indigenous saw them as invaders. Both were right in their own way, and so began the uneasy birth of a nation, one foot in Africa, the other still planted in America. A country founded on the belief that freedom could be built from the wreckage of bondage, yet already haunted by the same divisions that had once chained its founders. By the 1840s, the experiment had outgrown its masters. The American Colonization Society still sent ships, still issued decrees, still called the place a colony. But on the ground, the settlers had learned to govern themselves, not through mercy, but through necessity. Disease had taken many of the white overseers. Those who remained rarely ventured beyond the coastal settlements. The americoliberians were left to survive by their own hands, their own laws, their own faith. They built churches first, wooden, whitewashed with tall windows facing the sea, as if to remind themselves that God still watched from somewhere beyond the horizon. Sundays filled with hymns that carried across the water, songs half African, half American, melodies of longing sung by people who belonged fully to neither world. By then, the colony stretched along hundreds of miles of coast, divided into settlements named for the states that had once enslaved their ancestors: Maryland, Kentucky, Mississippi. But inside those names grew something unexpected: pride. The settlers began to call themselves citizens. They held elections, wrote newspapers, and argued in English about the meaning of freedom. In Monrovia, a lawyer named Joseph Jenkins Roberts, once a free black merchant from Virginia, rose in influence. He was soft-spoken but sharp-minded, a man who carried himself like the republic he dreamed of founding. To the settlers, he was a symbol of progress. To the American Colonization Society, he was useful. To the native chiefs inland, he was a puzzle. As years passed, tension grew. The society in Washington demanded obedience. The settlers demanded recognition. They had bled, starved, and built this land with their own hands. They no longer wished to be called colonists. In 1846, Roberts gathered the representatives of the settlements in a simple hall in Monrovia. The air was thick with heat and expectation. On the table lay a draft, a declaration not of rebellion, but of dignity. The words were familiar, echoing the same phrases once written in Philadelphia 70 years earlier. All men are born free and equal. The irony hung heavy, yet no one dared to break the silence. When they voted for independence, there were no fireworks, no parades, no cheering crowds. Just the sound of pens scratching on parchment and the slow beating of hearts that had known too much history. On July 26, 1847, Liberia declared itself a free and independent republic, the first in Africa. The settlers elected Roberts as the first president. The American flag was lowered. A new one rose, red, white, and blue, with a single white star and a blue square. One star for one people, one hope, one fragile dream. The flag fluttered in the same wind that had once carried slave ships across the Atlantic. But freedom, as always, was complicated. Independence did not erase the divisions between those who returned and those who never left. The settlers built a republic that looked American, spoke American, and governed like the country they had escaped. They wrote a constitution modeled on that of the United States, with one crucial difference: the right to vote, to own land, to hold office was limited to civilized people, a word that meant only themselves. The native tribes, millions strong, were left outside the new order. Their lands were taxed but not represented. Their labor was needed but not rewarded. Liberia was free, but not for all. Still, the dream was intoxicating. In Monrovia, merchants traded palm oil, ivory, and coffee with British and American ships. Missionaries built schools. Newspapers carried stories of progress. A hospital opened, a printing press installed, a law passed. To the outside world, Liberia was a miracle, proof that Africa could be civilized. But behind the whitewashed walls, poverty festered. The settlers were few, the challenges endless. Roads vanished into jungle. Inland chiefs refused to bow to Monrovia's laws. When persuasion failed, soldiers followed. The Americo-Liberian militias, dressed in black coats and brass buttons, marched inland to bring order. Villages were burned. Agreements were signed at gunpoint. The free had learned the language of conquest. And yet, even amid the contradictions, there was beauty. On the Sundays after rain, women walked to church barefoot through red mud, carrying baskets of fruit as offerings. Children played along the shore where their ancestors' ships had once anchored, unaware of the ghosts beneath the waves. At night, the lamps of Monrovia glowed faintly against the dark ocean, like fragile promises in a sea of memory. In Washington, the society claimed success. In Africa, a people tried to build a nation out of exile. Between them stretched the ocean, silent, endless, remembering everything. The new republic sent letters to the great powers, declaring its existence to the world. Most ignored it. The United States, embarrassed by its own hypocrisy, refused to recognize Liberia until 2 decades later. Britain saw it as a curiosity, France as an obstacle, the surrounding African kingdoms as an intruder. But Liberia endured. It endured because it had to. Its people knew too well what it meant to lose a homeland. They built a capital of clay and memory, a government of hope and hierarchy, a dream stitched together from American ideals and African soil. Liberia was both a triumph and a tragedy, a nation where freedom was both victory and burden, where the line between oppressor and oppressed blurred with each generation. In the years to come, Liberia would stand as a mirror to the world, reflecting not perfection, but the complexity of freedom itself. Freedom had come, but it came with a shadow. The people who returned to Africa carried within them not only the memory of chains, but the architecture of those chains, the laws, the language, the habits of power. In time, the americoliberians began to see themselves not as guests, but as guardians of civilization. They dressed like the gentry of the Old South, held balls in Monrovia's grand houses, spoke of refinement while the villages beyond the capital lived in hunger. Their sons studied the Bible and the Constitution, believing both to be divine. Their daughters wore lace gloves and sang hymns in voices trained by American missionaries. They were Africans by blood, but their souls had been shaped by another world. The irony was bitter. The descendants of slaves had built a society that depended on servitude. Indigenous people, who had once welcomed the settlers, now found themselves at the bottom of a new hierarchy. They worked the farms, cleaned the houses, paid taxes to a government that did not speak their language. The americoliberians called them country people and spoke of bringing them light. But the light was selective and the shadows deepened. In the quiet corners of the markets, whispers grew. Freedom for some, chains for others. President Joseph Jenkins Roberts ruled with dignity but distance. He negotiated trade treaties, sent envoys to Europe, and dreamed of recognition. Yet his government controlled little beyond the coast. Inland, the forest swallowed all signs of law. Chiefs still ruled by tradition, spirits still governed the rivers, and tribes fought over land as they always had. Monrovia's laws meant nothing in the mountains. When words failed, guns spoke. The militias marched under the banner of the Republic, burning villages that resisted taxation. Liberia's flag flew over ashes. The Republic of Freedom became a nation of fear. And still, the world looked away. To Western powers, Liberia was an experiment worth watching but not helping. To neighboring kingdoms, it was a curiosity, neither fully African nor truly foreign. Its people stood between two identities, belonging completely to neither. In their churches, sermons spoke of destiny. In their homes, silence spoke of doubt. The promise of liberty had turned into a question that echoed through every generation: who, in the end, was truly free? By the late 19th century, the country's divisions hardened into classes. The settlers formed the true Whig Party, a political machine that would dominate Liberia for more than a century. Its members ruled like an aristocracy, passing power from father to son. Elections were held, but outcomes were known. The same families filled the same offices. Democracy became performance. Power became inheritance. The Republic had survived, but its soul was shrinking. Still, on paper, Liberia thrived. Ships left Monrovia's harbor filled with coffee and palm oil. Schools and churches dotted the coast. Diplomats in Europe praised Liberia as a symbol of progress. Yet, inside, cracks widened. Indigenous children rarely saw the inside of a classroom. The wealth of the few depended on the labor of the many. And when anyone questioned this order, the answer was always the same: we brought civilization. We deserve to rule. The irony did not go unnoticed by history. As European empires carved Africa into colonies, Liberia claimed moral superiority, the only African nation never conquered. But that independence came at a price. Surrounded by colonial powers, pressured by Britain and France, Liberia ceded pieces of its territory to survive. Borders shrank. Pride grew brittle. To the outside world, the white star still shone on the blue field. Inside, the light dimmed. At the dawn of the 20th century, the country stood at a crossroads, too proud to yield, too fragile to change. Young Liberians began to ask questions their elders feared. Why do we wear the clothes of those who enslaved us? Why do we speak their tongue but silence our own? Why do we call ourselves free when our neighbors live in chains of poverty? The answers never came. When rubber was discovered, the American company Firestone arrived. In 1926, it signed a 99-year lease for over 1 million acres of Liberian land. In exchange, Liberia received money and a new kind of dependence. The plantations brought jobs but also control. American managers dictated wages and policies. The republic that had once fled oppression now bent to the power of corporations. The irony deepened. Independence without sovereignty, freedom without equality, dignity traded for survival. In Monrovia, presidents came and went. The true Whig Party ruled like a quiet dynasty. The Americo-Liberian elite dined beneath portraits of George Washington and quoted scripture about divine destiny. They called themselves the Black Americans of Africa. But outside the capital, resentment brewed. Indigenous tribes watched as the wealth of their land flowed away. Generations passed, and the distance between ruler and ruled became an open wound. And yet, beneath the corruption and the hypocrisy, the dream that had carried those first ships across the Atlantic still flickered. Every flag raised in the wind, every prayer whispered by a mother in the fields, every hymn sung in the heat of Sunday morning, all carried the same fragile hope, that one day freedom would mean all of them. Liberia endured not because it was perfect, but because its people refused to let the idea of liberty die. They had crossed an ocean of chains to reclaim their humanity. Even when they built walls around themselves, the sea was still there, waiting, patient, a mirror of what they had been and what they could become. The price of freedom was never meant to be cheap. It demanded generations, it demanded reckoning, and it demanded truth. The 20th century arrived like a mirror held up to Liberia's contradictions. On the surface, it was a country of proud independence, a black republic in a continent ruled by white empires. Its flag waved as a symbol of defiance. Its leaders spoke of unity and destiny. But beneath the speeches lay a truth that grew harder to ignore. Liberia was free, yet unequal, independent, yet bound. The Americo-Liberian elite, descendants of those who had once returned from America, ruled as if they were still on foreign soil. They lived behind gates in Monrovia, drank imported wine, and sent their children to schools abroad. Their accents carried the echo of Virginia and Maryland more than the sound of Africa. Beyond those gates, the majority of the population, the Capella, Kru, Bassa, Vai, and others, lived in villages without roads, without medicine, without voice. The government spoke of democracy, but elections were rituals. The true Whig Party had become the spine of the nation, unbending, unchanging, unyielding. One flag, one star, one rule. It was said that to be Liberian was to belong to the party. To belong to the party was to stay silent. The same families held the presidency, the ministries, the banks. Monrovia was small, but its shadows stretched long. And yet the country seemed stable, a quiet anomaly in a turbulent continent. When the world plunged into war, Liberia found itself courted by powers far greater than itself. During World War II, the United States saw in Liberia a strategic ally. Airfields were built, roads paved, ports expanded. American soldiers walked the streets of Monrovia, bringing jazz records, canned food, and dollars. President William Tubman, charismatic and shrewd, welcomed it all. Under his rule, Liberia became a stage on which the dream of modernity played. Cars in the capital, factories along the coast, promises on the radio. Tubman called it the open door policy. Investment flooded in, and with it came corruption. Firestone's rubber plantations grew vast, feeding the tires of American industry, while Liberian workers earned barely enough to live. The paradox deepened. The richer Liberia became, the poorer its people felt. Tubman spoke of national unity, but ruled like a king. He wore silk suits, traveled in motorcades, and built statues of himself. To the west, He was a symbol of stability, the good African. To his people, he was both father and master. He promised progress, but progress had a price. When Tubman died in 1971, the illusion of order began to crack. His successor, William Tolbert, inherited a nation of silenced voices. Tolbert was softer, idealistic, a man who wanted reform but was trapped by the system he led. He encouraged indigenous participation in government, invited new ideas, and even allowed small protests. But freedom, once given a taste, demanded more. The students of Monrovia began to speak openly about inequality. Farmers demanded fair prices. Soldiers whispered in barracks about the power they did not have. In 1979, a spark ignited. The government raised the price of rice, the nation's staple food, to favor local producers tied to the ruling class. It seemed a small decision, but hunger is a language that needs no translation. Protests erupted in Monrovia. The police opened fire. Dozens were killed. The rice riots shook the capital and shattered the illusion of peace. For the first time, the descendants of settlers faced the anger of the majority. The following year, the storm broke. On April 12, 1980, at dawn, a group of soldiers led by Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, a young man from the Kron tribe, barely 30 years old, stormed the presidential mansion. They found Tolbert asleep. Within hours, the old order fell. Ministers were dragged into the streets, tried by radio, and executed on the beach as crowds watched. The dynasty of americoliberians, the elite who had ruled for over a century, was gone. To some, it was justice long delayed. To others, it was revenge disguised as liberation. The world watched in silence as the republic born from the dream of freedom dissolved into the chaos of power reclaimed by force. Doe declared himself head of state. At first, he spoke the language of equality. He promised to end corruption, to unite the tribes, to give voice to the voiceless. But the weight of history was heavier than his words. Power twisted him. Suspicion consumed him. Enemies multiplied. What began as a revolution became another dictatorship. Under Doe, the divisions that had once separated americoliberians from the indigenous majority were replaced by new ones, tribe against tribe, fear against fear. The nation fractured. Foreign aid poured in as the Cold War deepened, and Liberia once again became a pawn in global hands. The United States armed Doe's regime in the name of stability, while the people starved. The flag still flew, the anthem still played, but the meaning of freedom had vanished into the smoke. By the 1980s, Liberia was a country haunted by its own history, a nation that had once tried to escape oppression, now repeating its patterns. The descendants of slaves had become masters, the oppressed had become oppressors. The dream of return had become a circle of pain. In 1989, the circle broke. Rebels crossed the border from Côte d'Ivoire. The Civil War began. It tore through families, villages, generations. Samuel Doe was captured, tortured, and killed. His death was filmed. The horror of it spread across the world, a grotesque echo of the past. The land of liberty had turned on itself. For 14 years, Liberia bled. The forests that had sheltered its founders now hid armies. The rivers that once reflected freedom now carried bodies. Children who had never known peace became soldiers. The cries that once crossed the ocean now echoed in the streets of Monrovia. The Republic of 1847 was gone, replaced by something that no one could recognize. And yet, even in ruin, Liberia endured. In the refugee camps, mothers told their children stories of a land that was once a promise. In ruined churches, people still sang hymns. In the ashes of cities, a stubborn hope remained. Because Liberia was never just a country, it was an idea that freedom is not a gift but a responsibility. History does not move in straight lines. It circles, stumbles, repeats, and sometimes it forgives. Liberia's story is proof of that. The same waves that carried the enslaved away and carried their children back still rise and fall along the Pepper Coast. The sea remembers everything: the chains, the sails, the prayers, the silence. And on certain nights when the wind is right, the people say you can hear it: the whisper of oars, the creak of wooden ships, the voices of those who crossed the ocean twice in search of freedom. Freedom found, freedom lost, freedom still waiting to be born. When the guns fell silent, Liberia was a ghost of itself. The war had taken nearly everything: lives, cities, faith. Monrovia lay in ruins, its streets lined with bullet holes and memories. The same buildings where independence had once been declared now stood hollow, their windows dark, their flags torn. The single white star still fluttered, but it no longer meant triumph, it meant survival. The peace did not come as a celebration, it came as exhaustion. After 14 years of blood and betrayal, the people had nothing left to give but the will to live. In 2003, the last of the warlords laid down their weapons, and for the first time in generations, the nation listened, not to speeches or gunfire, but to silence. From that silence, a voice rose. It was the voice of a woman. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, daughter of a Liberian father and a mother of mixed tribal descent, became the first female president in Africa's history. To some, she was the promise of renewal. To others, she was the last hope of redemption. Her task was monumental: to rebuild a nation born from contradiction, broken by its own dream. She walked through the ashes of Monrovia, where children played among ruins, where men carried the weight of loss in their eyes. She promised not perfection, but peace. Under her leadership, schools reopened, roads were rebuilt, the flag was raised again, not as a boast, but as a prayer. The world looked once more to Liberia, not as an experiment, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. Because in its shattered glass, humanity could see its own reflection, how we repeat the mistakes we refuse to confront, how the hunger for power can corrupt even the purest dream, and how forgiveness is the only bridge between destruction and rebirth. Yet the ghosts of history did not vanish. They lingered in every conversation about class, tribe, and identity. The descendants of americoliberians still lived in houses overlooking the ocean. The descendants of the indigenous still tilled the same soil. The wounds were quieter, but they were not healed. Poverty remained. Corruption returned in new forms. And outside the cities, villages waited for promises that never came. But Liberia had changed in one way that mattered. For the first time, the memory of slavery was not a shame whispered in dark corners. It was spoken aloud. The story of the ships, the settlers, the paradox of freedom all became part of a national reckoning. Museums opened, artists painted, filmmakers documented, students asked the questions their ancestors were not allowed to ask. What does it mean to be free? What do we owe to the past? What kind of future can grow from the soil of pain? The answers were not easy, but they were real. Liberia began to remember not just what it had suffered, but what it had survived. In 2010, a new generation stood on the same coast where the first ships had arrived nearly 2 centuries earlier. The waves rolled in, the same endless rhythm. A teacher gathered her students by the shore and told them the story of people taken, of people returned, of a land built on hope and haunted by history. The children listened. Some stared at the horizon. One of them asked, "Will we ever be free?" The teacher smiled, her eyes on the sea. "Freedom," she said, "is not a place, it's a choice. It's something you must make every day, even when the world forgets you." As the sun set over the Atlantic, the light turned gold, the same color as the flag's star. The waves rose and fell, whispering the same ancient rhythm that had carried millions away and brought a few back home. The ocean no longer judged, it only remembered. Liberia's story is not one of triumph or tragedy alone. It is the story of humanity itself, of what happens when freedom meets memory, when the oppressor and the oppressed change faces but not hearts, when the past refuses to stay buried until it is understood. It is a reminder that independence without justice is only another kind of captivity, that freedom without empathy is another kind of chain, and that sometimes the longest journey home is not across an ocean, but through the depths of one's own soul. Today, the world speaks again of liberation, of equality, of rebuilding what was lost. But the lesson of Liberia remains: we cannot build the future by forgetting the past. The dream of the freed must include the freedom of all, or it will turn into its own shadow. As night falls over Monrovia, the city hums with life once more. Lights flicker along the coast where the first settlers landed. Children laugh, vendors call out. Somewhere, a church bell rings, and the sea, eternal, patient, answers with its tide. It is the same sound heard by those who came before and those who will come after. The sound of a people still searching, still striving, still believing that freedom, though fragile, is worth the cost. Because freedom was never meant to be easy. It was meant to be true. And so, the story continues, whispered in the waves, carried by the wind, and written forever in the blood-red soil of the land of the free. History does not end with memory. It lives in the choices we make, in the silence we allow, in the injustice we ignore. Liberia's story is not a distant echo. It is a mirror held to us all. It asks, what will we do with the freedom we inherit, and what will we give to those still waiting for theirs? If the past has taught us anything, it is that freedom is fragile. It must be defended not only by words, but by understanding, by knowing the stories that came before us, the lives that were lost so that we might stand here today. So if this story moved you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Share it, speak of it, keep it alive. Because silence is how history disappears, and remembrance is how humanity survives. Every view, every voice, every act of awareness helps keep these forgotten histories alive. Subscribe, share, and stay with us as we uncover the hidden chapters of the world's past, one story at a time. This is slavery's dark past, where memory becomes resistance and remembrance becomes freedom.